Well guys, here we are on what is probably one of the most important days for gamers in the last few years. At least that's what Nvidia would like you to think. After nearly 2 years since the launch of the GTX 1080 and the Pascal architecture, we finally have some new round of gaming GPUs that offer a lot more performance. But they cost a ton of money. So this is the RTX 2080 Ti and the RTX 2080, and unlike many previous generations of NVIDIA graphics cards, their new Turing core architecture both changes and optimizes the way games are rendered. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on below these awesome looking heatsinks, and I'll be covering some of it here. However, if you're looking for some more technical details, I'll leave a link to our review article posted on our official website down in the description. Now, this video will be focusing on just one item that you all wanted to know about, and that is, how do these cards perform, and are they really worth the huge amounts of money that NVIDIA is asking for? So sit back with your cup of coffee and let's dive in. But first, a message from our sponsor.
The new T-Force Excalibur DDR4 memory is one unique RGB kit with awesome light spill from each module, and the special edition has a cool totem design on the light bar. You get lifetime warranty, up to 4000 MHz speeds, and full lighting control through the software. Check out the T-Force Excalibur RAM down below.
Alright, so I want to start off here with a closer look at what I think is one of the best looking graphics cards ever created. The RTX 2080 Ti and the RTX 2080 share an identical streamlined exterior design that uses forged and milled aluminum pieces in either a brushed look or a flat black finish. Every single part of this card looks like it was put together with an eye towards detail. Unlike previous Founders Edition cards that featured blower style coolers, NVIDIA decided to go with a different route with the RTX 2080 series. They use a pretty low profile downdraft heatsink with a pair of axial fans to draw in cool air. This does keep most of the GPU's heat within your case, but the design is supposed to lower noise and offer cooler core temperatures. Honestly, the looks of these cards actually make me wonder why anyone would buy one of the triple slot monsters from board partners. Some of those designs look way too bulky. Both of these cards require quite a bit of power, so the RTX 2080 Ti needs two 8-pin connectors, while the 2080 needs a 6-pin and an 8-pin. That means I would recommend at least a 600 watt PSU for the RTX 2080 Ti and a 500 watt unit for the 2080. But if you're rocking a Threadripper or an overclocked Skylake X system, add 200 watts to each of those numbers. The backplates on the 2000 series are actually pretty similar to the ones on the 1080 Ti, but the all silver coloring really makes them stand out. There's also a little secret hidden here too. This is the NVLink connector, which carries an SLI signal over a new interface that's capable of transferring up to 100 gigabytes per second of data between two cards. Now, there's a few things that you need to know about NVLink. The most important is that NVIDIA is officially discontinuing 3 and 4 card setups. In its current form, the RTX series only supports dual card configurations. The real benefit of NVLink is that it can customize workloads towards the most suitable GPU, and it can also share memory capacity and other key resources across multiple cards. That means two 8GB cards in SLI would have access to a true 16GB memory pool. It also can scale in linear fashion when moving to high-resolution displays. NVIDIA gave a great example of nearly 100% performance scaling when moving from 4K to 8K on current RTX series GPUs. That's pretty impressive, guys, and I can't wait to test it out. The I/O area of these cards are actually quite unique. There are 3 DisplayPort 1.48 outputs that can support 8K at 60Hz or 4K at 120Hz, alongside a single HDMI 2.0B port with HDCP 2.2 compatibility that can support 4K 60 HDR content. The cool addition here is the USB-C port, which is a first for any GPU. This isn't actually your typical USB-C data connector, but rather a virtual link interface that's supposed to provide data and up to 27 watts of power to next generation VR headsets. Alright, so let's end the tour right there and get on to what makes these cards tick. This is the Turing Streaming Multiprocessor, which is basically a building block for the core. The reason I wanted to showcase this is to explain how NVIDIA has changed things up to benefit today's games and future technologies. Don't worry, I'm not going to get too technical here. The first thing that you will see here is there are now dedicated integer and floating point units instead of just CUDA cores. This was done because NVIDIA realized the CUDA cores were often running integer operations while the rest of the cores sat idle. So they broke the two pipelines apart, so both types of operations can now be processed in parallel. NVIDIA says that this could lead to a 25 to 50% speed up in standard shading tasks. The biggest thing added into the main core blocks are the tensor cores, and each SM has 8 of them. These are units specifically designed to efficiently process deep learning algorithms for machine learning and artificial intelligence. Now, I know that's a lot to wrap your mind around, but NVIDIA is actually putting them to use with their deep learning supersampling anti-aliasing. Instead of the shaders being put to use here, the tensor cores analyze the scene and apply anti-aliasing where needed in real time. The end result is much higher frame rates when AA is enabled. Within each streaming multiprocessor, there's also 4 texture units and 96 kilobytes of shared memory. Finally, there's a single RT core which is meant to be hyper efficient at processing ray tracing tasks, something that previous architecture just couldn't do. NVIDIA is hoping to put these cores to use in future games for real-time lighting and shadow effects. So now that you know what each streaming multiprocessor is, let's take a bigger look at the TU102 core that's in the RTX 2080 Ti. This chip is made of up to 16.8 billion transistors and 72 streaming multiprocessors clustered into 6 graphics processing clusters, or GPCs. Separate from those sections are 96 ROPs that are broken into groups of 8, 6 megabytes of shared L2 cache, and 12 32-bit GDDR6 memory controllers. But this is the fullest configuration, and in order to minimize power consumption and increase yields, NVIDIA shaved off 4 SMs and eliminating their associated shader cores, texture units, RT cores, and tensor cores. Meanwhile, one block of 8 ROPs, a single memory controller, and some L2 cache were also removed. And all of this leads to the RTX 2080 Ti Founders Edition having some extremely high-end specs which are way better than what NVIDIA offered with the GTX 1080 Ti. It also happens to consume a lot of power, but that was pretty much expected given the performance NVIDIA is advertising. Another big addition is the new GDDR6 memory, which allows the RTX series to have impressive bandwidth, which is something required for 4K. The big deal here is the price, with the Founders Edition costing a crazy $1,200, which is $1,000 more than the base card and $500 more than the GTX 1080 Ti. Sure, it comes with an awesome looking cooler, upgraded components, and a slight overclock to the boost speeds, but man, it's still expensive. The RTX 2080, on the other hand, uses a different core than the Ti called the TU104, which means its specs are lower, but they are still supposed to be more than enough to overcome the GTX 1080 Ti. It should also be noted that it's much more efficient and comes with 8 GB of GDDR6 memory rather than 11 GB. The RTX 2080 Founders Edition cost around $800, which is still pretty expensive, especially when you compare it to the GTX 1080's original price of $550. However, if it can't outperform the GTX 1080 Ti while offering the advanced RTX features, it may end up being competitive. Speaking of RTX features, the RT and Tensor cores make these new cards part of NVIDIA's new RTX platform. This is an ecosystem made up of hardware, software, and APIs to add advanced AI deep learning and ray tracing into more traditional graphics pipeline. Honestly, guys, NVIDIA is betting big on ray tracing and deep learning methods that will become a huge part of next generation gaming. And it also seems to be working too, since there will be at least 26 games that will come with DLSS support in the next few months. And when you combine that with the ones that support ray tracing, there will be more games with RTX features than the total number of DX12 titles that are available today. But right now, other than Rise of the Tomb Raider, there aren't any other games that support RTX technologies. I'll be covering those in the future, but what we care about is how well these two cards perform in games that can be bought today. For this review, we'll be using a Skylake X system with an i9-7900X overclocked to 4.8 GHz, 32 gigabytes of memory at 3600 megahertz, and all of the other components listed here. One thing to note is that I didn't enable the new game mode within Windows 10 because it ended up messing up with some key benchmark results. You should also know that every one of the numbers you'll see in the charts was an average of 3 separate benchmark runs. We have more information about the benchmarks in the website article if you're interested. Okay, so let's start off with Battlefield 1 DX12. The first taste of what these RTX cards has to offer is pretty impressive. The RTX 2080 Ti is way out in front, and even the standard RTX 2080 is able to beat the GTX 1080 Ti by about 13%. The 4K results continue that trend too, but the GTX 2080 Ti stretches its legs even more, offering at nearly 50% improvement over the GTX 1080 Ti. Call of Duty continues the trend we saw with Battlefield 1. Both RTX cards are well ahead at 1440p, and the Ti offers some impressive numbers. However, turn on the stress at 4K and the RTX 2080 Ti's lead widens even more, while the gap between the RTX 2080 and the GTX 1080 Ti narrows a bit. This is likely due to the RTX 2080's smaller memory footprint. Destiny is next, and the performance seen here is just blazing fast from every one of the cards. Something I do want to mention right now is the RTX 2080's improvement over the original GTX 1080. It typically hovers around 50% or so, which is why I've been comparing it to the GTX 1080 Ti up to this point. These really are some fast cards, guys, but remember, they also cost a small fortune. My results in Far Cry 5 at 1440p are interesting, since according to the system's resource monitor, 2 cores on the overclocked 7900X were maxed out during the benchmark run with the RTX 2080 Ti. This could mean that its performance was slightly limited by the CPU, and again, at 4K the Ti surges further ahead while the RTX 2080 and GTX 1080 Ti are neck to neck. Forza was another weird one, and it seemed to be CPU limited again at 1440p, but that didn't stop the RTX cards from dominating. They did, however, pull ahead at 4K, and here even the RTX 2080 maintained a pretty big lead over the GTX 1080 Ti. That's pretty impressive. You can actually tell that Nvidia seems to have their optimizations done right for the Unreal Engine 4, and that's pretty important since there are dozens of games which use it. Here, the RTX cards absolutely dominate everything else, especially at 4K when the 2080 Ti jumps out to a nearly 60% lead. What you will likely see as these benchmarks go by is that Nvidia's core optimizations have allowed RTX cards to excel in TX12. Much like Battlefield, Hitman proves there have been some major improvements in this field when compared to Pascal cards, particularly at 4K when the new shading horsepower really comes into play. Moving on to a much more popular game like Overwatch, there is nothing to complain about it either at 1440p or 4K, but there's something I wanted to mention here. While the performance gains of 50% for the RTX 2080 Ti and about the same for the 2080 versus 1080 battle, we can't forget how much more these new graphics cards cost. They aren't inexpensive, but they do give you some amazing performance in today's games. Shadow of War is an extremely taxing game on the entire system, most of all the GPU's texture pipeline. Neither RTX cards had any issue pushing completely playable frame rates at 1440p and 4K while improving upon their predecessors by about 50% once again. Now by this time I know I'm starting to repeat myself, so let's just roll Rainbow Six results since they're pretty much in line with the other games tested in this review. Alright, so this is going to be a tough one since while Warhammer 2 Total War seems to be an extremely challenging game to run, it actually isn't, provided you use the DX11 mode. Creative Assembly's DX12 implementation has been in beta for years now, and it is still far from optimized. It actually runs worse than DX11, and we've included it here to show that even with a lack of in-engine optimizations, the RTX series has enough horsepower to deliver playable in-battle frame rates. Believe it or not, the latest Wolfenstien game actually provides one of the most surprising yet not completely unexpected results of this entire review. At 1440p, things seems to be going really well for the RTX 2080 Ti and the RTX 2080 since they're able to chew through frame rates despite every detail being maxed out. But when the resolution is increased to 4K, the RTX 2080's performance simply falls through the floor while the GTX 1080 Ti and the RTX 2080 Ti surge ahead. The reason for this is actually pretty simple. The 8GB frame buffer and lower memory bandwidth cause a severe bottleneck on the Manhattan mission we chose. Even Vega 64's higher bandwidth number allows it to finally become sort of competitive. The final game here in this 13 title test is Witcher 3, and the RTX cards go back to their normal leadership positions at both 1440p and eventually 4K as well. So there you have the performance results of the RTX 2080 Ti and the RTX 2080. But testing can't stop at this point since there were a few more additional things that we wanted to check out. First and foremost, let's actually see how these new cards compare or how they perform when you put them under pressure for an extended period of time. Because remember, modern GPUs start off with higher clock speeds as soon as the benchmarks begin, but when temperature rises, NVIDIA's boost algorithm kicks in and it tries balancing the performance, the temperatures, and the power consumption, which usually leads to lower frequencies. And that's why before benchmarking each game, we typically warm up all the GPUs with at least 2 minutes of load to better simulate how they will actually perform during real gaming sessions. Starting off with the actual temperatures, there are actually some interesting things going on. As you can see, the RTX 2080 doesn't go above 72 degrees Celsius, which seems to be what NVIDIA's default peak is for this card. The boost algorithm won't allow it to go beyond that. This means you could probably get some additional clock speed headroom by simply increasing the temperature limit in overclocking software. The RTX 2080 Ti, on the other hand, is something interesting too, since its temperatures are allowed to peak at a point that's 5 degrees higher, and that's where it remains. Basically, both of these are pretty cool running cards. But something did strike me as weird though. Nvidia could have easily squeezed some more performance out of the RTX 2080 by simply allowing it to hit a higher temperature like the RTX 2080 Ti. Maybe this was done to ensure a bit more performance separation between the two cards, or maybe for another reason altogether different. Anyways, on to clock speeds now. And here you can see what kind of effect NVIDIA's GPU Boost 4.0 technology has on clock speeds as temperature increases. Rather than pushing fan speeds up so the RTX series gets overly loud, they fluctuate core frequencies to balance temperature and power consumption. This also goes to show why it is very important to either perform longer benchmark runs to ensure the cards have a warm-up period before testing each game. While the RTX 2080 remains around 1900 MHz for the first 30 seconds or so, by the end of the 5-minute test, that gets reduced to 1845 MHz. This is literally right in line with the NVIDIA's Boost specification. The RTX 2080 Ti gets a bit more shaved off by going from 1785 MHz to 1680 MHz after 5 minutes. It too remains right near the 1635 MHz Founders Edition spec, so it's not bad at all. But what about power consumption? Well, let's have a quick look. I want to start with the RTX 2080 Ti because in pre-overclocked Founders Edition form, it consumes quite a bit of electricity under load. The RTX 2080 isn't that bad since it manages to outperform the GTX 1080 Ti, yet it requires less juice. However, this card doesn't tell the whole story since as a graphics card is able to process more information, CPU and system memory load increases as well, so other components are making both of these cards look more power hungry than they really are in related to slower, older GPUs. From a performance per watt standpoint, the RTX 2080 and RTX 2080 Ti are far superior to anything that's just released up to now. I mean, that Vega 64 is just embarrassing. Even though they are two of the most powerful GPUs ever made, the RTX Founders Edition cards are also some of the quietest I've experienced. At least that's what it happens when the RTX 2080 Ti isn't operating at extremely high frame rates. This is what the RTX 2080 Ti sounds like at idle. And now this is what it sounds like when playing games at well over 160 frames per second. There is a little bit of coil whine, that's for sure, and it becomes really noticeable, especially if you literally have your ears close up to the card. As you can see, I am running it on a test bench, on an open test bench to be more specific, but if you're wearing headphones or if it's inside a case, it might not be as noticeable. However, check this out. This is what the RTX 2080 Ti sounds like when it's running at a more reasonable 80 frames per second and under. It's almost completely quiet. Meanwhile, our RTX 2080 sample didn't exhibit any of these issues and it operated as quiet as a mouse through testing. So with heatsinks that seem to be more than ready to tackle the heat produced by the TU104 and the TU1 cores, let's actually get into some overclocking. But before we get into that, I want to mention that we haven't explored all the options when it comes to squeezing every bit of performance out of these RTX cards. For example, NVIDIA's board partners are actually including a scanning tool that NVIDIA developed alongside their GPU Boost 4.0 technology. This is what the EVGA implementation looks like. Basically, what it does is make overclocking easy for newcomers by launching a simulated load on the GPU while gradually increasing voltage and clock speeds. If you move the power and temperature limit sliders to higher values, the scanner will automatically shift its targets as well. It will eventually settle on a final overclock that should be stable for longer periods of gaming. What I did is use NVIDIA's scanner tool to set a baseline overclock on both cards and then went ahead to using manual inputs to dial the clock speeds. I should also mention that the automatic scanner doesn't touch memory frequencies, so I needed to work on those too. Basically, my goal was to hit the highest speeds possible that were also stable for longer gaming sessions, and that means the results will show frequencies each GPU settled on after 30 minutes of gaming. I should also mention that the fans were set between 41% and 52% for all tests, and even then, neither card came close to the assigned temperature target. If you recall, the RTX 2080 Ti Founders Edition settled at 1680 MHz in stock form, but with a bit of tuning, it ended up continually running at 1980 MHz. The memory didn't get all that far though, going from 14 GHz to just over 15.5 GHz. One thing to make note of is GDDR6 memory has error correction routines, which will cause it to throttle rather than show rendering errors most of the time, so detecting its true stable overclock is pretty challenging. The amount of headroom for the RTX 2080 is pretty reasonable, with its going for a boost speed of 1845 MHz to a relatively constant 2085 MHz. The memory on this particular card actually came close to hitting 16 GHz, which is super impressive. So guys, I think after spending a few hours working on overclocking the RTX cards, they do have some gas left in the tank if you actually need some more performance. However, much like with Maxwell and Pascal, they are strictly limited by the amount of additional voltage you can apply in overclocking tools. The cores rarely reach the higher power limit and never even came close to the temperature limit, so it's more than obvious that higher voltage setting would allow you to go even further. But how do these overclocked RTX cards perform? Well, let's check it out. In Battlefield 1, performance for the RTX 2080 Ti and the RTX 2080 gets a good increase of about 12% in both cases, but honestly, I would likely just keep the settings at stock speeds unless you absolutely need those extra few frames per second. Far Cry 5 provides a bit more interesting results. The RTX 2080 Ti gets a big bump, but the RTX 2080 sees a small increase. This could likely be due to a frame buffer or core architecture limitation rather than clock speeds. Okay, so I'm going to try to wrap this up as quickly as possible, but there is a lot to cover. There's no denying the fact the RTX 2080 Ti and the RTX 2080 are crazy fast. But having looked at the individual charts, what do they actually mean in the bigger overall picture? The first thing I wanted to take a look at is the RTX 2080 Ti Founders Edition's performance across all games being tested. It is extremely good at 1440p, but this is obviously a card meant for 4K and higher resolutions. In some cases, it was obviously bottlenecked by other system components at lower resolutions. But when gaming in UHD, it's almost twice as fast as the GTX 1080 and over 40% faster than a GTX 1080 Ti. Those are massive numbers, guys. Switching to the RTX 2080, and I'll say that it offers huge performance at 1440p by cleanly beating the GTX 1080 Ti at very good frame rates at 4K. When compared against the original GTX 1080 or even Vega 64, it doesn't even come close. However, there will be some rare ultra-high resolution situations where its 8GB frame buffer and memory bandwidth will become a limitation, like in Wolfenstien. Just be aware of that and modify a setting to reduce a game's memory footprint.
The Be Quiet Dark Base Pro 900 Revision 2 is here with a modern I/O for your Type-C accessories and Qi charging gadgets. The new hub is good for 8 fans and RGB strips, plus the interior is incredibly modular for airflow, water cooling, inverted systems, and now with a power supply shroud. Check out the V2 down below.
Alright guys, so I think it's time for some real talk. The RTX series is really exciting, and the frame rates being put out there are huge. But don't forget the fact that both these cards are really expensive. I mean, the RTX 2080 costs $800 and the 2080 Ti goes for around $1,200. That's expensive. In my opinion, people with a GTX 1080 or GTX 1080 Ti shouldn't really look into upgrading just yet, because those cards still offer great performance across the board, even at 4K. I just think that buying into the whole RTX series is just a little bit too high, especially for people who have just recently purchased a Pascal GPU. Now, I'd probably wait until the new year to see how things could shape up with the RTX features and HDR displays. But again, until then, the 1000 series cards are just more than capable enough to game or pretty much play any title that's currently available in the market today. But if you're looking for even more performance and bragging rights, and if you are thinking about picking up a 4K HDR monitor at a high refresh rate, then yeah, the RTX 2080 Ti and the 2080 are the only options you have available. But what about gamers who skipped Pascal altogether? Well, now might be the great time to upgrade, right before Christmas season's huge lineup of new games. If you had the money back in the day to buy the original Titan X, then you should be looking into grabbing the RTX 2080 Ti. The same goes for the 980 Ti users. It might be time to order the RTX 2080. The performance delta between high-end Maxwell cards and their Turing equivalents is just massive. Now, Nvidia is obviously asking gamers to pay a premium for features that may never become widespread in some games. Honestly, RTX technologies like ray tracing and DLSS anti-aliasing are pretty cool to see in tech demos and stuff, but it may take months or even years till we start to see them in more than a few titles. In the end, only you can decide if this is a good buy for your needs, but if I had to make a choice, I'd actually choose the RTX 2080 Founders Edition. It costs about $100 more than the custom GTX 1080 Ti cards, but hits reasonable frame rates in most games. Nvidia also made it pretty efficient, quiet, and overclockable if you need a bit more performance. Plus, it doesn't require you to put a huge $1,200 bet on upcoming tech. So there you have it. We finally have some new graphics cards, expensive graphics cards to be more precise, but we can soon expect less expensive alternatives to follow the RTX 2080 Ti and the RTX 2080. Now, for those of you who do have the money to purchase the RTX 2080 and the RTX 2080 Ti, you can be confident that these GPUs will be the fastest on the planet for the foreseeable future. I'm Igor with Hardware Canucks. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe to our new Bootstick on channel for the latest tech news and rumors. And of course, you can check out some relevant content over here. I'm signing off, and I'll see you guys in the next one.